Tell me something. Where are you right now? As these words reach you, are you listening from a city where the streets still hum faintly under the glow of neon? Or from a small town where the night is so still it almost feels like it's breathing with you? And what time is it there? Midnight, when the shadows press gently against the windows, or just before dawn, when the silence feels heavy with secrets that the day has not yet scattered. The hour matters, because some stories belong only to the night. This one drifts like smoke through the dark. It does not rush. It does not shout. It simply settles, wrapping around you in calm whispers that hide sharper truths beneath them. Chapter 1. The Seed of Power. The story of the Gambino family does not begin with a coronation, or even with a killing. It begins in the docks of Brooklyn, in the sweat and salt of a city that was already under siege by men who knew how to turn poverty into empire. Carlo Gambino, slight of frame, unassuming, a man with eyes like wet stone, arrived in New York in 1921. A 20-year-old Sicilian immigrant, carrying little more than the language of survival. He was not loud, not flamboyant, like other young gangsters who strutted down Mulberry Street with cigars in their mouths and pistols hidden under coats. No, Gambino was something more dangerous, patient. He belonged to the old blood, the cosa nostra tradition, brought over from the hills of Palermo, where men believed silence was worth more than silver, and loyalty was measured not in words but in blood spilled quietly. He entered the United States during the Prohibition era, a time when liquor was worth more than gold, when a single truck filled with whiskey could buy loyalty from judges, police, and senators. Gambino learned quickly that crime was not chaos. It was business. His first years were spent under the wing of Salvatore Toto D'Aquila, one of the first Mafia bosses in America. But Gambino had already begun to understand that true power did not come from being feared on the street corner. It came from sitting in a room where decisions rippled out like earthquakes, where entire boroughs bent to the whisper of your approval. Carlo rose not because he was the strongest, but because he was the quietest. His specialty was waiting for others to destroy themselves. When D'Aquila was murdered, Gambino moved on to Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria. And when Masseria was gunned down during the bloody Castellamarese War of the early 1930s, Gambino had already aligned himself with the future winners, Salvatore Maranzano and later Lucky Luciano. He played the war like a chessboard, moving silently while others were busy emptying pistols in the streets. By the time Luciano reorganized the Mafia into the modern commission, Carlo was already cementing his reputation as a man who would outlive all rivals simply by knowing when to step aside, when to smile, when to bow his head and let another boss walk ahead of him into danger. This was not weakness. It was strategy. FBI files later described him as a calculating, watchful man whose mild manner concealed a ruthless cunning. He avoided the spotlight, never flaunted wealth, and rarely raised his voice. But behind that quiet mask, he was weaving the foundation of what would become the most powerful crime family in American history. By the late 1950s, when Albert Anastasia, the brutal Lord High executioner of Murder, Inc., was assassinated in a barber chair, Gambino was ready. Some said he ordered the hit himself. Others claimed he merely stepped into the void. But the truth doesn't matter. What matters is that in 1957, Carlo Gambino became boss. And when he became boss, he turned the Gambino family into something more than a gang. It became an institution. He controlled the docks, the trucking unions, the garment district. He had senators and mayors taking his calls. At its height, the Gambino family was said to have over 3,000 made men and associates, pulling in billions through construction kickbacks, loan sharking, gambling, and labor racketeering. Fortune magazine once speculated that if the Gambino family were a legitimate corporation, it would rank in the top 50 of American companies. But Gambino was more than a CEO of crime. He was a ghost. Unlike his counterparts, he was never flamboyant like John Gotti, never reckless like Anastasia. He lived modestly in a Staten Island home, drove ordinary cars, dressed like any immigrant grandfather. Yet behind those curtains, He ruled a kingdom of fear so vast that the FBI admitted that at his funeral in 1976, the traffic jams in Brooklyn resembled the funeral of a head of state. Some 2,000 mourners filled the streets. But the truth is, tens of thousands more felt the tremor of his death, because with Carlo Gambino gone, the throne was suddenly exposed, and the fight to control it would spill more blood than any family in Mafia history. Chapter 2. The Fall of Shadows. When Carlo Gambino died in 1976, the newspapers wrote of an old man passing quietly in his bed, a heart weakened by age. But insiders knew better. His death was not just the loss of a man, it was the breaking of a dam. Carlo had ruled with patience, restraint, and calculation, but his successors would rule with fire, arrogance, and hunger. The family throne passed to his cousin and brother-in-law, Paul Castellano, a man who styled himself less a gangster and more a businessman. Castellano lived in a Staten Island mansion, so lavish it was dubbed the White House. He preferred veal cutlets and boardroom meetings over bloodshed, and he ran the family like a corporation. He was obsessed with diversifying into white-collar crimes, construction bids, corporate stock scams, and the infiltration of Wall Street. Under his reign, the Gambinos became less about street muscle and more about corporate fraud, and for a time, this shift brought unprecedented wealth. It is said that during his peak, Castellano controlled contracts worth billions, skimming off union pensions, padding invoices on skyscrapers, and inserting Gambino interests into every corner of the New York economy. But while Castellano built empires in suits, the soldiers on the streets simmered with resentment. They felt neglected, starved of respect, and worst of all, ignored. To them, Castellano was a boss who had forgotten what it meant to be a gangster. Among those who resented him most was a man who would become the most infamous Gambino of them all, John Gotti. Gotti was everything Carlo Gambino was not. Loud, flamboyant, brash. He wore $1,000 suits, drove Cadillacs, and held court at the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, where the press gathered like disciples at his feet. He craved the spotlight and manipulated it brilliantly, cultivating the nickname, the Dapper Don. But beneath the silk ties and charm was a predator with a volcanic temper, and Gotti seethed under Castellano's leadership. When Castellano began prioritizing his white-collar division, Gotti and other captains saw their power shrinking, their tributes diminished. The breaking point came in 1985, when Castellano skipped the wake of Aniello della Croce, Gotti's mentor and underboss. That single act was seen as an unforgivable insult, a signal that Castellano no longer respected the traditional bonds of the Mafia. To the old guard, Castellano was an emperor out of touch. To Gotti, he was a target. On the evening of December 16, 1985, outside Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan, Paul Castellano and his bodyguard were gunned down in a flurry of bullets as Christmas shoppers screamed and scattered. Witnesses described the scene as chaos, glass shattering, blood spraying across snow-dusted sidewalks, the smell of cordite in the air. The assassination was one of the most brazen mob hits in American history, carried out during rush hour in the heart of Manhattan, under the glowing lights of the holiday season. And yet, within hours, word spread through the underworld. John Gotti had seized the throne. He had orchestrated the hit, not with Carlo's patience or Castellano's subtlety, but with a gangster's blunt force. He became boss by spilling blood where everyone could see, and the underworld erupted with both awe and fear. To the newspapers, he was a superstar. To the FBI, he became target number one. To the Gambino family, he was both salvation and doom, because Gotti's reign was a paradox. On one hand, he brought back the glory days of street gangsterism, revitalizing the ranks, showering soldiers with wealth from heroin rackets, gambling dens, and loan sharking. He reminded the underworld what it meant to live loudly, unapologetically, to make the city tremble again at the name Gambino. But his ego was a double-edged sword. The very flamboyance that made him a celebrity also made him vulnerable. The FBI bugged his clubs, his homes, his meetings. They tracked his every move, and his every word. And eventually, it was not bullets that ended his reign, but microphones hidden in lamps and walls, recording his every order. In 1992, John Gotti, the Dapper Don, the man who strutted down Mulberry Street like a king, was convicted of murder, racketeering, and conspiracy, and sentenced to life without parole. His empire collapsed around him, and the Gambino family, once the crown jewel of the American Mafia, began to fracture under the weight of federal prosecutions and betrayals. But here is where the story takes on its most haunting dimension. Because some say the Gambino dynasty never truly died, it merely slipped into the shadows. Investigators claim that even after Gotti's imprisonment, the family quietly rebuilt, funneling billions through construction firms, trucking companies, and Wall Street scams. Others whisper that the true successors of Carlo Gambino are not men with guns in alleyways, but executives in boardrooms, laundering crime money into skyscrapers, real estate empires, and hedge funds. And the question that lingers, as unsettling as it is unanswerable, is this: did the Gambinos lose their power when John Gotti fell? Or did they simply evolve into something so quiet, so invisible, that the public forgot to keep looking for them? Chapter 3. The Prison Throne. When John Gotti was convicted in 1992, the press celebrated it as the fall of a king. Headlines declared the end of the Mafia. Politicians boasted that law enforcement had cut off the head of the beast, and the FBI congratulated itself on finally bringing down the most flamboyant mob boss of the century. But what they did not understand, what they had always underestimated, was that the Mafia was never about one man. It was about continuity, bloodlines, and shadows that stretched far longer than a prison sentence. John Gotti was locked in Marion, Illinois, serving life without parole in a maximum security cage. But his voice still carried weight across the East River. From within the walls, he attempted to run the Gambino family like a medieval king issuing decrees from a fortress. He passed messages through visits with his son, John Gotti Jr., who for a time was groomed as acting boss. Prison guards reported that his visitors always carried an air of reverence, as if entering a chapel rather than a penitentiary. And when word filtered back to New York that the boss has spoken, soldiers obeyed. But the reality was harsher. The FBI had learned from their mistakes. They bugged prison phones, monitored every visit, and turned every smuggled note into evidence. The fortress that Gotti believed was his throne was in fact a cage with mirrors, reflecting every move back at the government. This paradox, being both feared and silenced, defined the Gambino family throughout the 1990s. Gotti's son, John Jr., tried to fill his father's shoes, but he lacked the charisma, the volcanic energy, and the sheer iron of will that had made his father untouchable for so long. Jr. stumbled under the weight of expectations, becoming more of a figurehead than a true boss, while older capos grumbled in back rooms, questioning why they should pledge loyalty to a kid whose only claim to power was his last name. By 1998, John Jr. himself faced federal indictments, accused of racketeering and conspiracy, and he eventually stepped down, claiming he was leaving the life behind. But in the Mafia, blood ties are chains, and leaving is never so simple. Rumors swirled that his father had cursed him for weakness, that in hushed phone calls from prison, the elder Gotti spat venom at his son's failures. Whether true or not, the myth stuck. The Gambinos were now a family without a captain steering the ship, and that vacuum of power invited both chaos and opportunity. In this era, other names surfaced. Peter Gotti, John's older brother, nicknamed the Dumbest Don for his lack of cunning, stepped forward. He was a man more known for loyalty than brilliance, a caretaker of the family's fading power. Yet even under Peter's reign, the Gambinos still controlled key unions, construction projects, and international drug pipelines. The FBI estimated that in the late 1990s, despite the blitz of indictments, the family was still raking in hundreds of millions annually. It was a paradox that terrified prosecutors. The Gambinos were wounded, yes, but like a hydra, every time one head was cut off, another appeared, perhaps weaker, perhaps clumsier, but still deadly. Law enforcement celebrated victories. But within the streets of Queens, Brooklyn, and Staten Island, whispers continued. The family never dies. It just waits. What makes this chapter of the Gambino saga so unsettling is the sense of invisibility. The dapper Don had thrived in the spotlight, but his successors realized that shadows were safer. FBI agents noted that after Gotti's imprisonment, younger Gambino leaders deliberately avoided attention, dressing in cheap clothes, working from modest offices, blending into the immigrant neighborhoods that birthed them. They remembered Carlo Gambino's lesson. True power never advertises itself. And so while John Gotti decayed in prison, his body withering from cancer until his death in 2002, the family itself adapted, shifting from flamboyant extortion to subtle infiltration, construction bids, financial fraud, and international drug trade hidden in shipping containers, arriving quietly on the New Jersey docks. To the public, the Gambinos seemed finished. To those who lived in their shadow, they remained the silent kings of New York. Chapter 4. Blood on the Pavement. The turn of the millennium did not bring peace. It brought a reckoning. When John Gotti died in prison in 2002, it was like a thunderclap across the underworld. Some capos mourned him as a fallen titan. Others breathed relief, seeing a chance to escape his family's overbearing legacy. But the throne, as always, could not remain empty. Peter Gotti attempted to hold power, but his clumsy leadership left cracks in the Gambino empire. Cracks that federal prosecutors drove wedges into with relentless indictments. By 2003, Peter himself was convicted and sentenced to 25 years, leaving the family adrift once more. Into this void stepped figures who embodied the new generation of Mafia power. Men like Nicholas Corozzo, Jackie D'Amico, and eventually Frank Cali, each represented a different strategy. Corozzo with old-school muscle, D'Amico with careful diplomacy, Cali with an eye toward international business. Frank Cali in particular is where the story takes a darker, more speculative turn. Known as Frankie Boy, Cali was unlike the flamboyant dapper Don or the clumsy Peter. He was a ghost in a suit. Low profile, quiet, but deeply connected to Sicilian clans that controlled heroin pipelines across the Atlantic. The FBI described him as the future of the American Mafia, a man who could merge the traditions of the past with the globalized networks of the present. He avoided attention so completely that even seasoned investigators admitted they had only scraps of intelligence on him. His neighbors in Staten Island described him as polite, almost boring, a man who waved hello and tended his lawn, while behind the facade he was allegedly orchestrating international drug shipments worth millions. It was as if Carlo Gambino himself had returned in a new body. Invisible, patient, ruthless. But invisibility is not immunity. In March 2019, Frank Cali was gunned down outside his Staten Island home in a hail of bullets. The killing shocked the underworld because it broke the unspoken code. The Mafia does not kill its bosses so openly. Not in the era of surveillance cameras and 24-hour news. Rumors swirled. Was it an internal hit? Punishment for a deal gone wrong? Was it a message from rival families? Or was it, as prosecutors insisted, the act of a lone, unstable man with delusions of grandeur? The official explanation, that Cali's murder was random, committed by a young man in a fit of rage, never sat comfortably with those who knew the old codes. It felt too clean, too public, too theatrical. And so speculation grew. Perhaps Cali's death was not random at all, but a signal that the American Mafia was undergoing another transformation. One too deep and too dangerous for outsiders to understand. The death of Frank Cali proved something chilling. The Gambino family was still alive, still vulnerable, and still feared. After nearly a century, after indictments, murders, betrayals, and endless federal crackdowns, the name Gambino remained synonymous with the underworld. And yet, unlike the days of John Gotti, their power was now a whisper rather than a roar. They no longer strutted down Mulberry Street with photographers in tow. They moved through international finance, construction conglomerates, and offshore accounts, invisible to all but those who knew where to look. The blood on the pavement outside Frank Cali's home was a reminder that the family's story was not history. It was still unfolding, still dangerous, still very much alive. Chapter 5. Ghosts in the Concrete. The 21st century was supposed to be the graveyard of the Mafia. At least, that's what the FBI claimed as its agents lined press conferences, pointing to charts of fallen dons and faded mugshots pinned with red X's. The government had crippled the 5 families with indictments, RICO statutes, endless wiretaps, and high-profile trials. But the problem with legends is that they never really die. They retreat, shift shape, and learn to haunt in new ways. The Gambino family, bloodied by the loss of John Gotti and the assassination of Frank Cali, did not vanish. Instead, it sank deeper, embedding itself in the invisible scaffolding of New York and beyond. Construction firms with pristine offices downtown carried hidden ties to Gambino captains. Real estate companies buying up luxury apartments funneled cash through shell corporations, international shipping containers, moving through Newark and Elizabeth ports, carried not just electronics and clothing, but whispers of heroin, fentanyl, and counterfeit fortunes. A former federal agent once confessed off the record that the Mafia hadn't been beaten at all. It had simply grown too quiet, too sophisticated for the public to recognize. You're walking past them every day, he said, but you don't see them anymore. That's the point. The frightening speculation is that the Gambinos have achieved exactly what Carlo Gambino envisioned half a century earlier. Invisibility. No flamboyant bosses drawing headlines. No Cadillacs parked outside Little Italy clubs. Instead, whispers say they sit in boardrooms disguised as consultants, advisors, investors. Wall Street insiders have long whispered about sudden injections of liquidity, about hedge funds that appear overnight with hundreds of millions in unexplained backing. Could some of that money trace back to the vanished billions of Mafia rackets? Could the missing Lufthansa millions, laundered and multiplied, now live quietly inside portfolios of skyscrapers and tech startups? The FBI has never proven it, but the silence itself is damning. Every time there is a union scandal, every time a construction bid mysteriously collapses to the right contractor, every time a judge's ruling aligns a little too neatly with certain financial interests, the name Gambino flickers like a ghost just beneath the surface. Not proven, not disproven, only whispered. And this is what makes their story terrifying. The possibility that we will never know when the Gambinos are gone. Street gangs collapse in blood. Drug cartels splinter in spectacular firefights. But the Mafia, when it's disciplined, fades into the walls like mold. Investigators now speculate that the family has decentralized into cells that barely know each other, insulating themselves from indictments. Old men in Staten Island houses pass coded messages to nephews who run construction scams, while younger, nameless associates launder billions overseas through cryptocurrency, real estate, and shell corporations buried in the Cayman Islands. The family is no longer 5,000 loud gangsters in social clubs. It is dozens of ghosts, hidden across industries. Some experts whisper that the Mafia, and the Gambinos in particular, have already succeeded in merging with legitimate power to such an extent that dismantling them is impossible. If the family truly controls construction companies that build skyscrapers, if they influence pension funds, if they guide contracts that shape entire city blocks, then the Gambinos are not just criminals. They are part of the city's skeleton. To remove them would mean tearing down the very concrete of New York itself, and perhaps that is the final evolution of America's first family of crime. From knives in alleys to signatures on contracts, from bullets in steakhouse doorways to ghostly numbers moving through international banks, what began as a Sicilian boy on the Brooklyn docks has become something almost untraceable, unkillable. The Gambinos are no longer simply men. They are myth, rumor, shadow. You cannot indict a whisper. You cannot imprison a ghost. And so the story drifts to silence. But silence is not the same as ending. Somewhere, in a city apartment where the lights burn late, or in a Staten Island mansion with drawn curtains, someone still carries the weight of the Gambino name. Maybe they walk past you on the subway. Maybe they sit across from you in a boardroom. Maybe they shake your hand at a fundraiser, their smile warm, their eyes unreadable. You will never know. That is the curse of the Gambinos. Visibility means weakness. Invisibility means survival. And if survival is the truest measure of power, then perhaps the Gambinos have already won. Tonight, as you lie in the quiet, listen carefully. The streets may seem empty, the night soft, but history has a way of leaving echoes. A gunshot outside Sparks Steakhouse. The roar of laughter in a Little Italy club that no longer exists. The low murmur of a deal sealed in concrete and steel. And sometimes, if you stay awake too long, you might feel it, that prickling sense that the story is not over. That somewhere in the darkness, America's first family of crime is still watching, still waiting, still breathing under the surface of the city that made them. Sleep well. The Gambinos never do.